So we are at the offices of the Missoula Independent. It is the day before the special election to fill the vacant House seat for the Montana at-large district. There's some interesting national trends that are percolating around this race, so I thought it would be wise to confer with these two gentlemen who have been covering the race extensively from a local perspective. Um, could you just introduce yourselves?
Yeah, my name is Brad Tyre. I'm the editor of the Missoula Independent.
I'm Alex Sackerson, staff reporter.
Great. So one of the themes that I've found pretty interesting in being here and looking at the candidates' rhetoric and speaking to voters is there's this idea that Rob Quist is portraying himself as a true-bred Montanan. He's a native son. He has this authenticity about him, or at least he's trying to project authenticity. And my question is, does that projection of authenticity resonate as authentic with people, or can it be seen as condescending and sort of a pander? In your coverage of the race, does that angle that his campaign has pursued seem to be fruitful, or does it seem contrived in any way?
You want to take an initial swing at this, or?
Oh, Lord. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's definitely resonated with some voters that I've talked to, even just in casual conversation or at Saturday's event with Bernie Quist, or with Bernie Sanders, sorry. But I feel like that's kind of a mixed bag in Montana. There are folks, certainly out there who, when this type of candidate comes up, a Schweitzer or a Bacchus who, tries to, have a little folksiness, particularly like a John Tester with the farm. Some folks can see that as a little disingenuous or don't entirely buy it. But for the most part, I feel like Rob Quist's, sort of native son narrative has, gone over as authentic with most folks that I've talked to. So
I think it's a question that we as a paper try to kind of interrogate and not take too seriously. The us versus them state jingoism sort of narrative. The I'm a Montana native is only an asset when the other guy ain't from around here, right? So I think that's been used effectively against Gianforte with his. Obviously, he's got a long time Montana connection, but he's not originally from here. Most people in this state aren't originally from here. But that said, I think that narrative has worked against Gianforte. I think that critique has landed. And Quist is especially a good guy to make it, just because he's so well known as an entertainer from way back in the day in Montana. So I think he's used that skillfully. We don't take that too seriously in our own considerations, but I see where it lands with voters, yeah, or at least with the letter writers.
Yeah, because when you interrogate that argument for Quist, you can't help but conclude that it is a form of nativism, right?
Absolutely.
If you're promoting yourself as a native son of the land, and you have this authentic connection with, the state, that may be a more benign form of nativism than the one we associate with, racially tinged stuff. But it still is a form of nativism and should be interrogated on those grounds.
It's of a piece, certainly. And we ran an op-ed months ago by Dave Strohmeyer, who's on the he's county commissioner here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
former city councilman
and current county commissioner. Wrote an op-ed for us really kind of before election season kind of got up and running, but the whole point was election season's upcoming. You're going to see these arguments, you're going to see this narrative emerge about how the person who's more from here than the other person is better equipped. And I thought Dave had an interesting piece because Dave wasn't born in Missoula, but his kids were. And so he tried to turn that on his head, say, are my kids better equipped to represent Montana than I am, just by virtue of having been born here when I wasn't here, which I think highlights some of the absurdities of that argument. That said, Montana does have a long and sordid history of people coming in from out of state and buying their way to positions of power in this state. So while we don't strictly buy, I'm talking the editorial we hear, we don't strictly buy this idea that you have to be from here. I think that resonates in this state because it does have a long history of operating sort of as a resource colony of wealthy coastal, I won't say elites, wealthy coastal people coming into the state and exploiting it for what value is here, and then leaving. So that story resonates in Montana. Well, for good reason.
Yeah, and that folksy Quist, I think, has done a better job than other candidates in the past of using that to his advantage. Back in the 2012 race between Senator Tester and then Representative Denny Rehberg tried to play up his ranching background and his ranching property, and got called out for having subdivided it and having not owned livestock in decades, and it turned into a major hit. He played it up too much and got called out on a lot of stuff, and I feel like, in a lot of ways, Quist has been able to translate that into, a narrative that's resonated more, but, he hasn't gone too far in trying to tie himself into, ranch culture, things like that. So he hasn't, gone full Rehberg and gotten called out on anything. So,
well, and our editorial our endorsement didn't really hit on this, but everybody who runs for office in Montana plays that card. And so you get people in the pressed wranglers and the work gloves that have never been worn, much less worked in. And, that's all obvious on the camera. But Quist, I think, comes by his whatever degree of folksiness he has, honestly. I think he is that guy. So I think that works for him. But it's not just him. Gianforte is playing the same card with the tools that he has. You see him walking around in the snow with his bird gun and his orange camo. Every candidate I've ever seen in 15 plus years in Montana plays that same card. So everybody takes that swing.
Well, we've had how many political ads in the last couple of years with candidates shooting things? Rosendale did that famously, shooting a drone out of the sky. So it's.
Well, Brian Schweitzer's on that cover that we passed up at the office upstairs, holding the gun. That's how he wanted to be on that run. There's a combination of the folksy Montana thing and also the gun rights thing. Those merge pretty strongly in Montana.
Well, that narrative wraps a lot of that stuff up into one tidy little package that you can kind of, use your folksy character to stump on a couple different issues.
I have to say, as a native New Jerseyan, I've taken some umbrage with the attack on Gianforte that we see over and over again in the Quist material, as if being from New Jersey is somehow inherently sinister, but that's okay.
See, I'm from Texas, where they advertise the salsa.
Okay.
As I don't know if you're familiar with the classic ads, but a bunch of cowboys sitting around a campfire looking at Pace salsa, made in New Jersey.
Okay.
Get a rope. So I've seen that kind of Jersey is a handy target for that kind of jingoism. I'm sure you've seen it before.
Yeah. It is, and it's kind of deadened me inside to hear those constant attacks. But I've learned to deal with it.
Right. Well, we've got our own in Montana. We've got the Montucky thing. So everybody gets it.
So one of the reasons why, let's say, progressives nationally are interested in this race and even excited about it is because they view Quist being nominated by the Montana Democratic Party as a triumph for the Bernie Sanders-oriented wing of the party, and maybe a sign that the establishment of the party is increasingly accommodating itself to a more progressive-oriented worldview. But you're, and I think that might not be totally accurate per what you outlined in your endorsement editorial. What do you think and your editorial we should mention, and we'll link to it in the description box of this video. It encourages a vote for Quist, but it's not a particularly enthusiastic vote, let's say. So what do you think accounts for that disparity in terms of the perceptions of what Quist represents?
You should take the first swing.
No, you should take the first swing.
Well, I think what accounts for the disparity is that is the difference between seeing the race up close and seeing the race from a distance through the eyes of advocates who are trying to raise money for one side or the other. I don't want to overplay this hand. We did endorse Quist, and we do endorse Quist, and as an editorial unit, we think he's a far better choice than Gianforte. So I don't want to underplay that. And I think we're the only paper of any sort in the state that did endorse him. So this idea that we're not on board with Quist, the editorial supports that. I get it, but let's not overplay it. I don't think very many people in the know in Montana buy that story that this is some sort of progressive uprising that the party has acquiesced to. I think a lot of people who follow politics in Montana would tell a story more along the lines of a state Democratic Party that is out of ideas and out of confidence in its legitimate candidates. Amanda Curtis is the one that most comes to mind. And that we see a Montana Democratic Party that said, well, Amanda didn't win last time. Let's run a white guy in a cowboy hat. That might turn the tide. That might play in Montana. And that's not a groundswell of support for Quist. When Quist was announced as the candidate, it kind of came out of the clear blue sky for most people because there wasn't this grassroots clamoring for Quist. To my understanding, and Alex might know better, he was pretty well handpicked by Brian Schweitzer and then approved by the party for the ballot. So I view the Bernie Sanders progressive storyline as a pretty genuine, legitimate, popular uprising. This wasn't that. This was a handpicked candidate from the top down put on the ballot. That's not to say that Rob Quist isn't a good guy and doesn't have some good quality progressive leanings, but it's just to say that this didn't come up from the grassroots. This was handed down.
I think this says a lot more about the state Democratic Party than it says about anything going on with the National Democratic Party. Mostly because, as Brad alluded to, Schweitzer came out, our former governor, Brian Schweitzer, populist himself, talked about for the presidential run and all that years ago. He came out and endorsed Rob for this, candidacy in January. And then, there was no primary here. This was, delegates who are members of the state Democratic Party getting together at a nominating convention like they did for Curtis after John Walsh dropped out of the Senate race in 2014. And they picked the candidate. And if you look at it from that angle, I think what Rob Quist represents more from a state Democratic Party perspective is the folksy populist Schweitzer or Tester who have managed to win statewide office against strong Republican, opponents and maintain those offices despite, Republicans winning, majorities elsewhere in the legislature. And so I think that element plays more in this race, that Rob Quist he was sort of the mold that we already had in this state. And the state Democratic Party recognized, okay, we could put Amanda Curtis, a school teacher, a legislator, a blue collar Butte Democrat from Pat Williams's hometown on the ticket for a seat that's going to be maintained for 18 months, or we could put the mold we're familiar with and play up some of those same talking points that have worked for folksy Democratic male candidates in the past. So
yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the dynamic that's playing out from inside the state is more of what we've seen before, and maybe from outside the state it looks like something new is happening. But if you've watched the Democratic politic dynamics play out in Montana over the course of a decade or so, it's really kind of nothing new. This is a tried and true model of the folksy white guy.
Yeah, I actually spoke yesterday, coincidentally, with the executive director of the Montana State Democratic Party, whose name is now escaping me. But yes. And I asked her flat out, did the nomination of Quist represent a break from the status quo in any meaningful sense? And she said no. so, so I mean, at least they're pretty blatant about that. Although it might have the appearance of some kind of bucking of the status quo, really is just a continuation of it with maybe a little bit of a different dressing.
Well, yeah, and I think what the Democrats have been struggling with, in the last couple of years at these sort of congressional level races is we've got John Tester, a very strong, much beloved, he's got his own, detractors in the state, but those are mostly very bill or policy specific, problems. Otherwise, he's a very popular politician back here in the state, but other than that, we've had,
And by the way, Tester won in 2012, right when Romney won Montana by a large margin. So Tester demonstrated that he could at least siphon off some segment of the populace that would be inclined ordinarily to vote Republican on a federal level.
Yeah, which I think is in part a virtue of his strong ties to the ag community. I mean, he's a farmer. He comes back almost every weekend, to try to work the farm because he and Charla, his wife, don't have, a whole lot of help on the farm. But I feel like, in watching, because I've been covering politics and particularly federal level races in the state for quite a number of years now here. And I mean, in 2014, we had John Lewis running in the House race. And after the, the John Walsh scandal on the Senate side, we got Amanda Curtis. We had two very strong, young, vibrant Democrats with, some experience either inside, congressional policy shops or in the state legislature. And neither of them, got a very strong showing at on election day. And then we had Denise Juneau last year, another young, more vibrant, politically experienced Democrat, and she lost to Ryan Zinke, who was running for re-election. And so I feel like if you view that string of events at the House and Senate level throughout the last couple election cycles, Rob Quist makes a ton more sense for the state Democratic Party, especially when they're having to consider, next year we're going to have to be running to maintain this seat anyway, and who knows who's going to come out of the Republican woodwork at that point.
So one issue that I thought was interesting, and actually if you cover what's going on a national level, this is dominating the discussion. But one of the debates. Here's what I wanted to ask you. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Let's cut it there. So you interviewed Quist on a Facebook Live program a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what you made of his grasp of the issues, because on one hand, there seems to be some virtue in encouraging people who are amateurs to run for office. You don't want Congress to be utterly dominated by lawyers and career politicians, quote unquote, and business people. You want people with a diversity of backgrounds, and Quist has an unorthodox background for somebody pursuing higher office. At the same time, though, he seemed to lapse into some kind of rote talking points and didn't have the most adroit understanding of some of the issues. At least that's what I gathered, and that's sort of what I gathered from watching his debate performances and his public rallies. Again, doesn't mean he's a bad person. That's just not something that he's been immersed in for a huge portion of his life, and maybe some people find that refreshing. But I'm just curious, what did you make of his grasp of the issues?
Well, I mean, we had tried to craft a list of questions ahead of time that spoke to a number of issues that locals, care about, the folks back here in the state care about, trying not to get too into the heady politics of it all, but, giving folks an opportunity to see a sort of wide spectrum of his stance on issues. And a couple of those were submitter, questions as well. They were submitted in advance. I mean, some of the questions, he seemed to have started to get an understanding of how to, wing an answer. But others, he seemed to kind of default to this sort of, talking point based, or he'd go into an anecdote. I mean, it was a little odd on the transgender, question. I thought it was, his answer was not quite what I had expected, for a candidate coming into an interview with, Forward Montana and Last Best News and the Missoula Independent on Facebook out of Missoula. I mean, that's kind of an issue that you you'd get some talking points on, or you'd at least get kind of a grasp on. But you know, he did kind of struggle through, just like you mentioned with the debate. You know, he seems to have seems to lack a little, enough familiarity to really articulate an authoritarian, position on things. He doesn't.
I hope you mean authoritative.
Authoritative. Edit that.
I don't mean to sit here and edit you.
No, it's okay. That's what you're there for. I mean, it feels like there's maybe he's not quite as confident on a lot of these issues, and it's understandable. I mean, up until February, March, he didn't really have to think a whole lot about the deep ins and outs of these issues. And I will say, like, his speech on Saturday at the Bernie Sanders rally was one of the stronger speeches I've seen. He seems to be, kind of getting it a little more, but, in a condensed election cycle like this, I had expected to walk into the Facebook Live event, getting a few some answers that were maybe a little clearer, or a little more, this is going to sound so ironic, a little more well articulated. Mm-hmm. Not that I'm doing a great job of that right now, but
you're not running for office. So.
Yeah, well,
God help us.
Yeah, I expected more clearly articulated answers to some of those questions, at least, that have been asked already, and not as much kind of defaulting to some of the same phrases that we heard at the debate and have heard in a couple of public appearances. So.
I guess the idea is that the state party was willing to make a trade-off where they would accept somebody with maybe a little less articulateness, a little less in-depth immersion in the issues, and trade that off for somebody who has maybe this certain cultural sensibility or can connect with segments of the populace. At least that would be maybe their calculus.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it also, it was odd. I will say it was the first time I've done an interview with a political candidate who's recited a poem as part of the interview. So that was interesting.
From memory, by the way.
Yeah, from memory. And he recited the same poem at the Bernie Sanders rally, which was, interesting as well. But yeah,
I was at the Billings rally, and he recited a poem that was Billings specific there.
Oh, really?
So he has a number available to him.
Well, he's got. I would expect that when it comes to music and poetry and stuff, he's got quite a repertoire to draw from. But it was an unexpected moment in that interview for sure. Not that it was a good thing or a bad thing. It was just unexpected. Yeah, I'll say. Did you have any thoughts?
Well, I think you're right in terms of the party's calculation of running somebody who might not be, that question of articulateness. I think it's there's the question of sort of what level of articulateness does the voting public expect versus what level of articulateness does maybe like a media outlet expect, and a media outlet sort of stock and trade is words and how they fit together and how they communicate, and so we might be more critical or more interested in that question than the general population. I hate to come off as cynical, but I can't help it because I kind of am cynical. But I wonder if
Here.
I wonder if I tend to think that almost anything that gets said in a campaign is necessarily, by virtue of being campaign discourse, is shorthand. It's meant to signal, not necessarily plumb the depths of any particular policy or whatever. And I haven't seen anything that suggests to me that Greg Gianforte is an amazing campaigner or a wonderfully articulate, explainer of complicated concepts or anything. And I don't think it's really their job. I'm defending Quist here after having written that editorial that was so incredibly lukewarm. But I mean, I don't think that's really part of their job. They're figureheads. This guy's not. Neither Rob Quist nor Rob Gianforte is going to be leading the government. They're not going to be. They're not going to be leading any change. They're creatures of their party. And this does come back to the editorial and a point that we made that we thought about a lot and took some internal criticism for, this idea that you're not really voting for a candidate, you're voting for a party. In this case, I don't think anybody thinks Rob Gianforte is ever going to caucus with the Democrats on anything of substance. I don't think anybody thinks that Rob Quist is going to caucus with the Republicans on anything of substance. He's going to have a staff. He's got a party. He's going to be led. I won't say by the nose, but I don't think Rob Quist is going to be making individual personal decisions about how to vote for the most part, and neither would Gianforte. I don't think these people necessarily have to be policy specialists. They're joining a team. I don't know if politics was always like that, but certainly it's been this partisan for a long enough time to where I don't think we should really be surprised that, we're electing a linebacker, basically. And that's as far into a sports metaphor as I'm going to go because I'm not a sports guy. But, we're electing some guy to play on the team. So if neither one of them is an outstanding candidate, it's like, well, what kind of role player would they be? And I feel like that's what's happening in this race. Which team do you want to see do better? And we're not a big fan of Team Trump right now. So if all we can do with this election is send a signal, it doesn't bother me too much that Rob Quist is not the most articulate communicator or policy specialist.
Well, and it maybe speaks to just how kind of spoiled in recent years we've been in Montana with candidates who have come from a background and can kind of articulate things a little better. I mean, even John Lewis had worked in Baucus's policy shop, so I mean, he'd been one of the guys who was actually crafting policy and directing things in a certain direction and advising Baucus. And so when you've had candidates with a deep familiarity with the political ins and outs, even just at the state level, and then you kind of have somebody who's a little less articulate, I feel like it maybe jumps out more to members of the media than it would to the public. And so that's maybe where my hang up comes from.
But if your whole point is to run a candidate who's representing average Montanans, not some hoity-toity outsider, then well, most people aren't policy specialists, and most people don't speak in finely crafted paragraphs, and I think that comes with the territory of asking an outsider, a non-politician, to run for the job. They haven't been trained. Like a guy like Steve Daines never goes off message. I don't know how articulate he is, but I mean, he knows what he wants to say and he says it and he gets it out there and it's done. But in a lot of ways, that also represents the business as usual that you're running against when you run, a regular Montanan outsider. So I don't think that lack of articulate grasp of the issues is too big a hurdle for Quist. Actually, it hadn't been for Trump. I mean, the people who love him in no small part precisely because he talks incoherently the way that most of us do most of the time. Yeah. That's not a drawback.
Do you see the larger anti-Trump sentiment in the country, or the quote resistance sentiment, as in any way a driver of what may be gaining traction for Quist, or is that like imposing a national narrative onto a race that has fundamentally local dimensions? Because that's sort of what the national media is attempting to do. I'm just wondering if that sort of jives with your personal experience in any way.
I think that's very much the case in what passes for urban areas in Montana. We're in a blue bubble here in Missoula, and there are some other ones around the state, but I think we're maybe first and foremost. Butte is pretty. Yeah. Butte's blue, but it's not.
It's blue collar.
It's more blue collar blue than
college blue.
Than college blue. That's a kind way to put it. Right. I think there's a lot of Quist support happening in Missoula. We'll speak to Missoula because we know Missoula. That's very much in line with resistance attitudes. Outside of the urban areas, I'm less sure. I don't really know. I mean, when you get out there, you're getting into the areas that supported Trump and still do. So I don't really know how that plays out in the more rural areas of the state, which are very important. But in a town like Missoula, I think the Venn diagram between Trump resistors and Quist supporters is basically just a circle.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a lot of Trump resistance, but I'm not entirely sure how many of those folks wouldn't be supporting Quist if we were in a different different situation if we didn't have, the Trump resistance thing going on. I mean, this is still a fairly democratic town,
right? And
folks are going to line up behind a Quist or a Bernie pretty quickly.
That's a good point, and especially in this race, because Greg Gianforte is not the type of moderate Republican who's likely to siphon off Democratic voters in Missoula anyway, no matter who he's running against. So yeah, that's a good point. I think there's a lot of overlap between Quist and sort of Trump resistors, but I think Quist would have those voters anyway, even if that dynamic wasn't overlaid on it.
Yeah,
against this opponent. You
might have a little less of the sort of energized, like, I'm freaking out about the Trump agenda. you might have a little less of that, and certainly some of the national attention that's been thrown on this race wouldn't be there. That's kind of elevated the level of spending and the presence of Bernie Sanders and Alyssa Milano, stuff like that. You probably wouldn't have that without the Trump agenda on the line. But Greg Gianforte lost last year when Trump took the state, so I'm just not sure how much that sort of Trump resistance is the sole factor or a heavy factor in the Quist rise. So
yeah, you're right. I do think there are a lot of Quist voters, though, who are looking at this through a lens of, this is the only possible way that I can channel my resistance vote. What else do I do with that? So I think he's gaining some energy from that.
And my question, are those people who would have otherwise maybe not have been compelled to get involved in a congressional race, and they are involved now because it's an outlet for their anti-Trump frustration? Or is it just, like you mentioned, maybe just the same kind of coterie of people who would have been pretty activated in a race like this, regardless of context? I mean, I don't know. There's no firm answer to that question.
I don't have a good sense of that.
I've seen a lot of the faces that I've seen at Quist events just here in Missoula have been faces I see at political events all the time. This is a very political town because it's a college town. It's a liberal college town. And so a lot of folks like to get really active, particularly in an election year, even in a midterm. They like to, encourage their friends to vote and put up the yard signs and all that. And maybe some of the organizations or some of, a few new faces have kind of taken a more active stance because of the Trump resistance issue. But I'm just not entirely, convinced that it's that big a driver in this town, right? So,
well, and what I've seen suggests that turnout so far is not more than and maybe less than it usually is, and I guess we'll find out when the final numbers are in. But it seems like the early voting forecasts were suggesting turnout was pretty low. Have I been reading about that?
Yeah.
Which works against this idea that everybody's all.
Yeah, but that I haven't seen anything that's been specifically like Missoula's turnout is low.
Yeah.
I've seen a few that are like statewide turnout is low so far through absentee numbers, but that could just be that folks in rural pockets of the state just are disengaged. That'll happen. It's that time of year. I think folks are pretty weary after the last heavy election cycle. We had so much going on last year in this state.
That's the other dynamic. Then Dan Brooks' column coming out in our paper tomorrow kind of addresses this. We've been in endless election cycle, and I think there's some amount of exhaustion with it.
Yeah, it's been like almost 2 years at this point. With the governor's race started, kicking up early, and Bullock was already, sort of pseudo running for re-election, even before Gianforte had declared. And so
I think there's even a level of fatigue nationally just stemming from the hangover of the 2016 presidential race, which people still haven't gotten over in a lot of ways. So if you couple that with whatever was going on a state basis, it just makes this general feeling of malaise, I think, that people just want to disengage for a while.
Well, yeah, and there was no honeymoon period after that, and there's this barrage of confusing and disorienting news has been unrelenting since then. So yeah, I know I'm exhausted by it. I don't there hasn't been an opportunity to kind of turn off and do other things.
Well,
right?
and we just
it's demanding our attention.
And we just had the
constantly.
legislative session.
Right.
So
and
I
we
mean,
just got
you've
out
got
of
a
session.
special election going on, as we've got the legislative session going on, which happens like once every 2 years, and it's 88 days this time around. It's usually 90, but first 3 months of the year are legislative coverage and special election, and so now it's just kind of, I think every political reporter in the state is maybe looking forward to taking a nap on Friday, but
Right. Well, and we've got our story meeting coming up right after this, and we'll going to be looking for stories about cats and I don't know what else. Puppies, cats and puppies mostly probably.
I would read those stories. Just to conclude, and thanks again for taking some time out for us. One of the moments that made me cringe when I watched that debate a few weeks ago was Quist all of a sudden taking the initiative to call out Gianforte's investments in Russian entities. That seemed to me like an instance of perhaps the national democratic resistance narrative seeping in to the local messaging. And I don't know if he's really kept that line of attack going in the subsequent weeks, but it didn't really register. I mean, Gianforte's retort, which is that the Montana public employees have the same sorts of investments, seems like a pretty unimpeachable response to me. So I'm wondering, like, what was your reaction when you saw Quist go down that road? And by the way, his communications people have been blasting out attacks along those lines as well through email and otherwise.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it was for starters, I didn't expect that talking point to come up in the context of a question about North Korea and tensions there. So it was the pivot there was quite interesting, and the problem was, I mean, the campaign had already kind of put out a bit of this, and Quist, in answering the question and in pivoting to the Russian investments, didn't seem like he fully understood like what how the investment scheme broke down, and that kind of put Gianforte in an advantageous position to rebut. And so it was an odd situation, but I think that speaks to this race. Just looking at my inbox every morning, this race has seen a lot of Oppo research, and there have been email blasts, and there have been leaks to the press and all that from both sides. All these crazy. I mean, you've got the fact that Quist hasn't had a hunting license, and then all of a sudden you've got a story about Gianforte, shooting an elk without brow tines, and so it's like you get all these really weird.
And the great STD debate of 2017.
Yes, exactly, and so like you.
Wait, I'm sorry. What was the great STD debate? I must have missed that one.
I'm going to let you look that up.
Okay, look that one up.
Look that one up. So it just seems like there's been so much, and maybe it's just because it's condensed and they've had to fit all of the mudslinging that would normally come out over 9 months to a year into 3 very short months. But it just seems like a lot of that, the Russian investments and a lot of other talking points or focal points for both these campaigns have come out of like opposition research that they've been trying to push in the press, and sometimes you get these emails and you just go, there's no substance here. What good does this do to the average voter? I mean,
it feels
odd.
Sorry, I don't want to
No,
interrupt.
go ahead.
But that feels to me, and I haven't really followed that rabbit hole all the way down, but it feels like a missed swing. The Russia issue. It feels like they're kind of prodding around looking for an effective angle of attack, and that doesn't. I don't think that one has landed. That got a big eye roll in every newsroom that I'm familiar with. Kind of when it landed, and I don't think that one quite connected. That seems like a missed swing to me, but and I don't know where it came from. Doubtless it came from some sort of Oppo research, but I don't know like what party is, whether it's the national party or the state party or who's really kind of trying to promulgate it. But I don't think it's a big deal, and I don't think people are treating it as a big deal.
Well, it presumably came from this idea that having a Russian investment is now treated as uniquely odious, right? And they're trying to capitalize on that sentiment out there.
That also, I mean, that it just seemed really suspect that that missed swing, that line of attack also happened to strike the Russian investigation and Russian interference chord. I mean, Russia was still so much in the headlines and still is.
Yeah, but it's just too many dots to connect. It's
and it feels like something. It was just a moment when, you know, it was a swing that missed, and it was a swing that I'm not sure, you know, most voters really understood.
I got a
when they saw
401k.
it.
I'm probably invested in Russia. You know, it's just not, I don't think it landed with voters. And
No,
it seemed like kind of a desperate swing. It's like,
there's too much in there for you know, voters to have to parse out. But then of course all the media has to jump on it and try to dissect it and, you know, cross-examine it, and it's, you know, it throws media into a weird situation where you're writing about this thing that most voters are rolling their eyes about anyway. So.
All right. Well, I think we can leave it there.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Every possible question. In the best possible way.
Just about, I'd say.
All right.
So we will be in Montana through the election tomorrow, and thanks again for taking out some time to speak to us.
Our pleasure. Thanks for talking with us.
Thanks a bunch.